Well, travel with me long, long ago and far, far away, where there was a poor cobbler. The cobbler and his wife were not only poor, but as time went on, they got poorer and they became very hungry as well. One day, the cobbler woke up and he said, "Today, I must find something for us to eat. I'm going to go fishing at the river." So he picked up his fishing rod and he went to the river and he fished all day and he caught nothing. The next day, the second day, he went back down to the river and he fished all day and he caught nothing. And the third day, he took his fishing rod and he went down to the river and he said to himself, "If I don't catch something today, I will just lie down here on the riverbank and die." And just then he felt a tug on his line and he pulled out a fish, a large, beautiful fish. Its scales, red and gold, gleamed in the sunlight. But that was not the extraordinary thing about the fish. The extraordinary thing was that the fish spoke. Now, this happens in stories, and usually if there's a fish that speaks in a story, it asks you to release it, and sometimes it'll give you a wish or maybe even three. But that was not the case with this fish. The fish gave a recipe for how he was to be cooked. He said, "Take me back to your cottage and have your wife boil me in a pot of water and then divide my flesh into 5 portions, 1 portion for you, 2 portions for her, and the remaining 2 portions to be planted in your garden." Well, when a fish talks to you and gives you a recipe, it's probably a good idea to listen. So he took the fish home. He told his wife the instructions. She followed the instructions. She was pleased to have 2 portions of the fish. She gave him 1, which was better food than he'd had in a while. And they buried the other 2 in the garden, both feeling like that was a terrible waste of some good food. But time passed. And after many months, the cobbler's wife gave birth to twin boys, as alike as peas in the pod. And about that same time, there sprang up in their garden 2 plants. And as the boys grew, the plants grew. And as the plants grew, it became clear that they were not going to yield fruit or flowers. It looked like what was growing on those 2 plants were small lances and swords and helmets and shields. And so the boys grew and the plants grew. And finally, when the boys were almost men and the plants, all of the armaments on the plants were ripe, the boys said, "And now we will be knights." And so they harvested the weapons and armaments and they set off down the path. Now they traveled together for quite a while, but after a time they came to a fork in the road and they took that as a sign that they were to separate. And so the first night of the fish went this way and the second night of the fish went that way. And the first night of the fish, he traveled for many days until he came to a village. And as he entered the village, he noticed that everyone seemed very sad. They were weeping, they were wailing, everyone was in tears. And when he asked why, they said, "Well, every year, there's a dragon that lives nearby, and every year he demands sacrifice of 1 young woman. And this year, the sacrifice is the king and queen's only daughter, the princess. And we love her, for she is not only beautiful, but she is also kind and intelligent. This is a tragedy." And the knight of the fish thought to himself, "This is a job for a knight." And so he went out to the field where the dragon was said to meet his victims. And sure enough, there was the princess standing by the tree. When she saw him approach, she said, "Quickly flee. The dragon will be here any minute and he will eat me, of course, but if you're here, he will eat you too. You should run." And so the knight of the fish, he turned around and ran. And even though she was the one who suggested that, that just made her weep all the harder. But after a few minutes, he came back. And he came back with a large mirror. He said, "Quickly, take off your veil and put it in front of this mirror. And when the dragon shows up, when it gets very close, take the veil off the mirror and hide behind the mirror." And then the knight of the fish hid behind some large rocks. It wasn't long after that that they heard a terrible roar. And there was the dragon. It was long and thin and fine with red and gold scales that gleamed in the sunlight. And he got closer and he roared his terrible roars and he rolled his terrible eyes and he showed his terrible claws and he gnashed his terrible teeth. And he got closer and closer and closer. And when he was very, very close, the princess just reached over the mirror and she whipped off the veil. And then she hid behind the mirror. And what the dragon saw in that mirror was, he supposed, another dragon, a fine, fierce dragon. And so when he gnashed his terrible teeth, the dragon in the mirror gnashed his terrible teeth as well. And when he roared his terrible roars, the dragon in the mirror roared his terrible roars as well. And thinking that he was about to be attacked by a fierce dragon, the real dragon attacked first. And he smashed that mirror into 100 pieces. And in every mirror shard, there was part of the dragon's body reflected. And for just a moment, the dragon thought, well, perhaps that is my body and I have been defeated and I am lying in pieces. And puzzling that over in his mind, just gave enough of a pause that the knight of the fish came out from behind the rock and killed the dragon with his lance. Well, the princess and the knight went back to the village, and as you can imagine, there was much rejoicing. Everybody was so happy, and they said, well, since you have rescued the princess, we think it's only fitting that you and the princess should be married. Well, the princess looked at the knight looked at the princess, and they said, sounds good to us. And so they were married. And the story could end there, couldn't it? Happily ever after? But wait, there's more. A few days after they were married, the knight was looking out the window in the palace, and he saw on a distant hill a very ominous looking black castle. What is that? He said to his wife. And she said, oh, that castle is made of obsidian. It is the castle of Albatross, and it is very evil. No one has gone to that castle and has returned. And the knight of the fish thought to himself, this looks like a job for a knight. And so that very morning, he gathered up his helmet and his shield and his lance and his sword, and he headed up to the castle, the Black Castle. When he got closer, he could feel the gathering darkness and evil around that castle. When he got up to the entrance, he took his horn and he blew a note and he called out, is there anyone in the castle who can open to me, a squire, a knight, even a page? Now I must tell you about this castle, that it was the home of echoes, which he had awakened with a blast on his horn. And so when he said, is there anyone who will open to me, a squire, a knight, even a page? There came an echo, even a page, even a page, even a page. Well, said the knight of the fish, will you let me in, yes or no? And the echo came, no, no, no. Well, he boldly rapped on the door, and a grate to the side of the door slid open, and there he saw a nose, a very long, rather hideous nose, which he found was attached to the ugliest face he had ever seen, a face of a hag. But she looked out at the knight of the fish, who was standing there looking brave and valiant, and she said, oh, come in, you will be my husband. He said, no, indeed, I can't be your husband. For one thing, I'm already married, but even if I weren't, I would never marry such a one as you. She frowned at that, but said nothing. Well, let me show you my castle, she said. And she took him from room to room, each one fancier and more opulent than the last. So much gold, so much silver, so many jewels. He admired it all. She said, but I have saved the greatest treasures for the end in the tower. Follow me. And he began to follow her up a staircase, very narrow, very dark, very winding, so dark that the knight of the fish did not even notice when the hag stepped aside into an alcove. He continued up the stairs, until he was standing on a trapdoor, which opened, and he fell down, 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 down into a dungeon, dead. Well, we could end the story there too, couldn't we? But wait, there's more. It was only a week or so later that the second knight of the fish, who had been traveling here and there and back again, ended up in the same village where his brother had experienced his adventures. And when the second knight of the fish began to walk through the roads and paths of the village, he was startled because everybody seemed to recognize him. They greeted him, they waved at him, and they seemed awfully pleased to see him. And then a band struck up, sort of a royal march, and a couple of servants came out and they said, "Oh, you must go and see your wife, the princess. She will be so relieved to see that you're alive." And he thought to himself, that's happened again. Something that has happened my whole life. People have confused me and my brother. But it sounds like my brother may be in some difficulty. I won't say anything until I find out what has happened and what I can do. And so he went to the castle, and the princess ran out. She threw her arms around his neck and she said, "Oh, I'm so relieved to see you alive. You're the only one who has ever returned from the Black Castle alive. And so did you go to the Black Castle?" Yes, I did, he said. "And what did you find there?" "Oh, I cannot say until I have returned once more." "Oh, please don't return." "But I have vowed to do so." "Well, I suppose if you must, you must. But you must be bone tired. Only come to bed with me." And he said, "No, I have made a solemn vow to never sleep in a bed until I have gone back to the castle and returned." And so the second night of the fish, he spent that night on a hard bench in the hallway, rather than in the soft bed with the princess, whom he now realized was his brother's wife. Good decision, right? But early the next morning, he set out for the Black Castle. And he, like his brother, felt the black and evil spirit around that castle. He came to the entrance. He blew a note on his horn that awoke the echoes. And he knocked on the door. The grate opened, and the hag with a hideous nose peered out. He said, "And have you recently been visited here by a valiant knight?" And the echo said, "A valiant knight, a valiant knight, a valiant knight." "And was he here at your hand ill-treated?" "Ill-treated, ill-treated, ill-treated." The knight said, "Where is my brother?" And the hag said, "Wouldn't you like to know?" And he said, "Yes, I would." And he drew his sword and he pressed it up against her neck. And she said, "Your sword has pierced my skin, and now I will surely die. But if you bring me back to life, I will tell you about your brother." He said, "If I bring you back to life, how am I going to do that?" She said, "Well, after I'm dead, go to my garden and gather the flowers of the everlasting plant and the leaves from a plant they call dragon's blood. Crush them and put them in a pot of boiling water. And when it is boiling, then put my body in the water and I'll come back to life." At least that's the way the recipe goes. Story is all about weird recipes, isn't it? Well, he did just that. She died. He gathered the flowers of the everlasting plant and the leaves of the dragon's blood plant. He crushed them in mortar and pestle. He mixed them in water in a large, large pot. And when it was boiling, he put the hag's body inside. And sure enough, just as she had said and just as she had hoped, she came back as alive as ever she was. Sadly, she was no less ugly. But he said, "And now where's my brother?" And she said, "I will show you." And she took him down to the dungeon where his brother's body lay lifeless, surrounded by the bodies of many other knights who had been subjected to the same treatment. And in the next door dungeon, there were the bodies of all of the young women who had been sacrificed to the dragon. Well, the second night of the fish, he sprinkled the remainder of that magic water over all the bodies, and the bodies came back to life. They were pleased to be alive again, but they looked at that hag with some enmity. And the hag realized that all of her evil doings had now been undone, and that now she was facing a veritable army of young men and young women who had many reasons to wish her ill. With that, she flew into a rage, and it was such a rage that she simply died, this time for good. And so it was that the first and second night of the fish, they returned back to the castle, where the first night of the fish was reunited with his princess bride, and the second night of the fish found a young woman among those that they had rescued to marry. And then the two nights, they went back home to their home village, but only long enough to bring their parents back to live with them in the castle. And so that is the end of the story. And all of those that we hoped would live happily ever after actually did. There's just one more thing, a piece of advice for all of you. If an ancient and magical hag or a talking fish gives you a recipe, you'd best pay attention. Thank you.